and welcome to CYC News for the 3rd of December 2017 and the 24th of Hatur, 17:34 AM. I'm Yasin Twadros, and in today's headlines, food arrives in Yemen following weeks-long blockade, Saudi Crown Prince collations with fight terrorism until it is eliminated, son of the late Saudi king freed from detention, how a common enemy is changing Israel-Saudi relations, Airstrikes kills 57 in Syria just days before peace talks, why the masquerade of Muslims in Sinai was too radical for an Al-Qaeda. The US and Russia are fighting over extradition of hacking mastermind, antibiotic resistance, an old problem with new consequences, Copa Libertadores, Gremio beat Lanus to become champions for third time. But first to Yemen, where a critically needed shipment of food arrived in the war-torn country last Sunday, with more aid on the way. This was the first shipment of food to arrive since Saudi Arabia imposed a blockade of the country in early November. According to pro-Houthi Yemen Defense Ministry, in the country's capital Sana'a, a commercial ship owned by a Yemeni businessman carrying 5,500 tons of flour arrived at Yemen's Houthi port last Sunday. A UN World Food Programme vessel carrying 25,000 tons of flour also arrived at the Al Salif port last Monday, according to Abir Atifa, Senior Regional Communications Officer for WFP. The arrival of food aid follows the arrival of aid workers and vaccines. Atifa said a passenger plane carrying around 1.9 million vaccine doses, enough for 600,000 children, landed in Sana'a last Saturday morning. Atifa said to feed the 7 million people suffering severe famine, we need this kind of access on a regular basis, as we had before November 5. Ships carrying food, chlorine tablets for drinking water, and medicine supplies to support the prevention and treatment of acute watery diarrhea and cholera, and also on their way to Yemen. To Saudi Arabia now, where Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has said the country's 2-year-old military coalition would pursue terrorism until it is eradicated completely. These remarks were made at the inaugural meeting for the Saudi-led Islamic Military Counter-Terrorism Coalition. The group's first meeting came in the wake of the deadly attack on a Safi mosque in Egypt's northern Sinai on November 24th, which killed more than 300 people, including 27 children. At the meeting of defense ministers in the Saudi capital of Riyadh, Prince bin Salman said, "I express today our condolence to our brothers in Egypt as a leadership and people for what happened in the past days." The coalition, which has some 40 members, does not include Saudi Arabia's arch-rival Iran. In recent weeks, the kingdom has exercised a more assertive regional foreign policy, intensifying its military campaign in Yemen and taking a more aggressive stance against the Iranian-backed militant group Hezbollah in Lebanon. Qatar, a member of the coalition, was also noticeably absent. According to Reuters, the IMCTC's Security General Abdullah Al-Saleh said the country was not invited to the meeting in order to build consensus between member countries. A Saudi-led quartet of Arab countries placed an embryo on Qatar in June, accusing the tiny Gulf country of supporting terrorism. Qatar firmly denies the allegations. Senior Saudi Prince Mehtab bin Abdullah has been released after being detained 3 weeks ago as part of sweeping anti-corruption drive, a source close to the government has said. It is believed an undisclosed financial settlement has agreed to secure the prince's release. Prince Mehtab is the highest profile detainee to be released after hundreds of people, including senior princes and Saudi business magnates, were caught up in a wave of arrests on November 4th. Prince Mehtab is the son of Saudi King Salman's predecessors, the last King Abdullah. Until being fired by royal decree, he was head of the kingdom's elite National Guard, one of 3 main branches of the country's security apparatus. After the anti-corruption arrests, the kingdom's top legal officials said investigations revealed at least $100 billion had been misused through systematic corruption and embezzlement over several decades. The arrest came hours after King Salman decreed the creation of an anti-corruption committee led by the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Around 200 businessmen and officials were detained in the November 4th operation, including at least 17 princes and top officials. Many of them are being held at Riyadh's lavish Ritz-Carlton hotel, which normally plays host to visiting foreign dignitaries such as US President Donald Trump. Now, two former spies masters sat an arm's length apart, occasionally laughing with the crowd gathered at a synagogue in New York's Upper East Side. At one end sat Ephraim Halevi, who led Israel's Mossad at the turn of the century. Next to him was Prince Tariq bin Faisal Al Saud, who headed Saudi Arabia's intelligence agency for 24 years. The panel discussion in October was about the future of the Middle East. A few years ago, such a meeting would have seemed inconceivable. To this day, Israel and Saudi Arabia don't have diplomatic relations. Until recently, any ties between the two countries, if they existed, were never discussed openly. Now the dynamics of a changing Middle East have revealed an association built on mutual interest, namely countering Iran's growing influence in the region. For Israel and Saudi Arabia today, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Speaking to Israel Army Radio last week, Minister of Energy Yuval Stenitz admitted what many had long suspected. We have partially clandestine ties with many Muslim and Arab countries. It's the other side that is interested in hiding it. Our ties with the moderate Arab world assists us in blocking Iran. To Syria now, where airstrikes killed at least 57 people in two separate towns last Sunday. The continued fighting came 2 days before a fresh round of United Nations facilitated peace talks were to start in Geneva. UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said in a statement Russian airstrikes killed 34 civilians, including 15 children, in the ISIS-held village of Al-Shafa in Syria's eastern Deir ez-Zor province. Al-Shafa sits on the eastern bank of the Euphrates River, one of the last areas occupied by ISIS in the region. Many of those wounded in the airstrikes are in critical condition, which could cause the death toll to rise. The Russian defense minister announced a series of airstrikes were aimed at ISIS strongholds, ISIS militants, and ISIS military equipment. It is unclear whether these attacks were the same as the ones that hit the village of Al-Shafa. Separately in eastern Ghouta, a rebel-held suburb of Damascus, Syrian regime airstrikes and shelling killed 23 people, including 6 children. Various Islamic rebel groups control eastern Ghouta, and the suburb has been surrounded by Syrian regime forces for more than 4 years. Eastern Ghouta is part of the 4 de-escalation zones in Syria, which were negotiated by the Russian, Iranian, and Turkish governments in May. In theory, residents in the area should be in a safe zone free from airstrikes, shelling and fighting. However, the situation inside eastern Ghouta is dire, with the UN reporting severe food and medical shortages. According to the United Nations, an estimated 400,000 civilians have been killed since the Syrian conflict began in 2011. It is unusual for militant Islamists to condemn terror attacks against non-believers, but so grotesque was last Friday's onslaught in Egypt that several extremist groups have threatened revenge against its predators. While no one has yet claimed the attack, its location and method point to the Islamic State in northern Sinai. This group has proved both ruthless and resilient in the face of the Egyptian military's attempts to crush it over the last 4 years. More than 300 people were killed as they attended prayers at the Al-Rawda mosque near the Sinai town of Bir al-Abd. The mosque was associated with the Sophia tradition within Islam, which is regarded as apostasy by ISIS and by some in Al-Qaeda. The Islamic State in northern Sinai is an affiliate of ISIS and the most powerful jihadist group in Egypt. Smaller militant factions closer to Al-Qaeda quickly distanced themselves from the mosque attack. Jund al-Islam, which is regarded as pro-Al-Qaeda, declared that it was a great sin and transgression to violate the sanctities of Muslims. Another militant group, Ansar al-Islam, offered condolences to the families of the victims of the massacre and said that God promised torment for anyone who killed a Muslim unjust. In a statement issued last Saturday, it pledged to take revenge against transgressors who spilled the blood of worshippers in a house of Allah. The condemnation of the attack is evidence of the ever-widening enmity between ISIS affiliates and Al-Qaeda-inspired groups and raises the question of whether the latter will begin to confront ISNS military as well as ideologically. To Europe now, where a young Russian alleged to have mastermind a massive hacking of social networks including LinkedIn and Dropbox is now at the center of an extradition struggle between the United States and Russia. Yevgeny Nikulin was detained in October 2016 in the Czech Republic capital of Paraguay after US authorities issued an international arrest warrant for him. He was on vacation with his girlfriend at the time. A grand jury indictment filed in 2016 in California charged him with computer intrusion and aggravated identity theft, among other offenses. Nikulin denies all the charges, but if convicted, he faces a maximum sentence of more than 50 years in prison and more than $2 million in fines. But soon after his arrest, Russian authorities also sought his extradition. The Russian charges referred to the alleged theft from an online money transfer company back in 2009. The amount involved was $3,450, which pales in comparison with the accusations laid out by the US prosecutors. Lincoln said the 2012 breach of its severe might have compromised the credentials of 100 million users. The foreign minister in Moscow said soon afterward it was actively working with the Czech authorities to prevent the extradition of a Russian citizen to the United States. In health news, the World Health Organization has said a post-antibiotic era is hardly an apocalyptic fantasy. The idea that key antibiotics could be rendered useless against even minor infections is instead a very real possibility for the 21st century. But the problem goes back much further. Researchers in France recently looked at historical samples of one Salmonella strand dating back as far as 1911. What they found was the genes that make these bacteria resistant to a drug called ampicillin emerged before that antibiotic even went on sale in 1961. The researchers say that this is probably due to another antibiotic that was used in low doses to promote growth in farm animals. According to Dr. Jim Hughes, professor of medicine and public health at Emory University in Atlanta, the idea that one antibiotic can provoke resistance to another is not a new concept. The genes that protect bacteria from our drugs can even hop across species, riding on circular loops of DNA called plasmids. Plasmids are often loaded with multiple resistance genes. Hughes said, while researchers have been sounding the alarms for decades, finally over the last couple of years it's been getting the attention that has been long overdue, and that is richly deserved. The US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention estimates at least 2 million Americans contract antibiotic-resistant infections every year and that 23,000 die as a result. And finally, in sport, Brazilian side Gremio has returned to the summit of South American club football for the first time in 22 years, beating Argentina's Lanus to claim the Copa Libertadores title. More than 30,000 fans packed into Gremio's stadium to watch their side in the final of South America's most prestigious club competition. Even though the match wasn't taking place there, it was being played more than 1,000 kilometers away in Buenos Aires. The first leg had taken place in Brazil a week earlier, with Gremio emerging with a narrow 1-0 win to take into the second leg in Lanus, a district to the south of the Argentine capital. Gremio won the second leg 2-1, handing them their third trophy, 3-1 on aggregate. And that's all for CYC News, and a reminder that you can watch the news bulletin again throughout the week on YouTube. I'm Justina Tuadros from the CYC studios in Sydney, Australia. Have a good night.